On the night of March 17, 1897, the residents of Bethnal Green awoke to a spectacle of terrible magnificence. The Bryant and May Match Factory, that towering monument to industrial enterprise, had become a cathedral of flame. The fire brigade arrived at 2:30 in the morning to find the eastern warehouse entirely consumed, the heat so intense that it could be felt across the street. Inside, some 300,000 boxes of lucifer matches fed the conflagration, each ignition cascading into the next, creating what witnesses described as a peculiar, almost rhythmic crackling, like the devil's own percussion. The fire marshal's report, filed with the Metropolitan Police on March 19, noted several irregularities. The blaze had originated simultaneously in 3 separate locations. The warehouse doors had been barred from the outside. And crucially, a night watchman named Thomas Ridley lay dead in the courtyard, his skull fractured by what the post-mortem examination determined to be a heavy, blunt instrument, applied with considerable force. This was not merely arson. This was murder, and it was not the first time. The man responsible for this catastrophe had been born 31 years earlier, not 5 miles distant, in circumstances that might charitably be described as unfortunate, and more accurately as wretched. The 1871 census records for the parish of Whitechapel enumerate a family by the name of Pritchard, residing at 14 Dorset Street, a thoroughfare that would later achieve infamy for its association with rather darker crimes. The household comprised James Pritchard, age 34, occupation listed as dock laborer, casual. His wife Mary, age 29, and 5 children, of whom the third was our subject, William George Pritchard, then aged 4 years and 7 months. The census enumerator's notes are revealing. In the margin, barely legible, appears the annotation, dwelling condemned, severe damp. This was characteristic of the rookeries of the East End, where entire families occupied single rooms, where typhoid and cholera visited with grim regularity, and where the mortality rate for children under 5 exceeded 40%. William's childhood unfolded against the backdrop of Britain's imperial zenith, a curious paradox, wherein the greatest empire the world had known permitted its capital's working poor to subsist in medieval squalor. The social reformer Charles Booth, in his seminal survey Life and Labor of the People in London, would classify Dorset Street as belonging to the lowest category, vicious, semi-criminal. Court records from the Worship Street Magistrates' Court reveal that James Pritchard appeared before the bench 17 times between 1871 and 1878, charged variously with public drunkenness, assault, and on one occasion, theft of a brass fitting from the West India docks. The family subsisted on Mary's earnings as a washerwoman and whatever irregular labor James could secure, when he was not, as the constabulary reports delicately phrased it, incapacitated by strong drink. William Pritchard received no formal education. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 had made schooling theoretically compulsory, but enforcement in the East End was, at best, perfunctory. Instead, at the age of 8, William entered employment at a tannery in Bermondsey, where he worked 12-hour days treating animal hides with lime and dog feces, a process that left his hands perpetually raw and imparted a stench that no amount of washing could entirely remove. The 1881 census finds him, aged 14, still at home, occupation now listed as match dipper. He had secured employment at Bryant and May's factory in Bow, the very establishment he would, 16 years hence, reduce to ashes. The match industry of late Victorian Britain was a particularly cruel enterprise. Workers, predominantly women and children, dipped wooden splints into a phosphorus solution that frequently caused phossy jaw, a necrotic condition wherein the jawbone literally rotted away, glowing green in the dark. The factory girls worked in poorly ventilated rooms, their wages subject to arbitrary fines for talking, lateness, or dirty feet. In 1888, these conditions would spark the famous match girls' strike, but in 1881, complaint was tantamount to dismissal, and dismissal meant starvation. William Pritchard lasted 9 months before he was discharged. The foreman's notation in the personnel ledger reads, "Dismissed for insubordination and suspected theft of materials." Between 1882 and 1890, William Pritchard's name appears with increasing frequency in the records of metropolitan police stations across East London. The charges escalate in severity: drunk and disorderly, assault of a peace officer, breaking and entering, robbery with menaces. But it is in 1891 that we encounter the first documented instance of his signature crime. On the night of November 4th, 1891, a warehouse belonging to Messrs. Thompson and Sons, timber merchants of Limehouse, was entirely destroyed by fire. The flames spread with such rapidity that the adjacent cooperage also succumbed, and a barrel maker named Edmund Cross perished in the blaze. The inquest jury returned a verdict of death by misadventure, attributing the fire to the accidental ignition of wood shavings. However, a constable named Albert Weston noted in his incident report, a report that was, inexplicably, never forwarded to his superiors, that he had observed a male person, approximately 30 years of age, departing the vicinity of Thompson's premises with undue haste at approximately midnight. Constable Weston, being engaged in other duties, did not pursue the individual. 5 years later, Constable Weston would identify that individual from a photograph as William Pritchard. Between 1891 and 1897, metropolitan London experienced 17 major industrial fires. This was not, in itself, unusual. Fire was an omnipresent hazard in an age of gas lighting, open flames, and wooden construction. What was unusual, as a young insurance investigator named Geoffrey Harman began to discern, was the clustering of these incidents in the East End, their occurrence exclusively during the hours of darkness, and their consistent point of origin in storage areas containing combustible materials. Harman's analysis, presented to the London Fire Engine Establishment in January 1897 but largely ignored, identified several commonalities. Each affected establishment was engaged in manufacturing or storage. Each had recently dismissed workers or reduced wages. And in 6 instances, night watchmen or security personnel had been found unconscious or deceased, their injuries attributed to falling debris but exhibiting, Harman argued, suspicious contusions consistent with assault prior to the fire's commencement. The industrial magnates of London were less concerned with theories of systematic arson than with the immediate imperative of reconstruction and the resumption of profitable operations. Harman's report was filed, unread, in the archives of the Fire Engine Establishment, where it remained until 1923. What manner of man sets fires? This question occupied the nascent science of criminal psychology in the late Victorian period. The Italian physician Cesare Lombroso, pioneer of criminal anthropology, theorized that arsonists belonged to a distinct category of moral imbeciles, driven by a primitive fascination with destruction. The alienist Henry Maudsley, writing in the Journal of Mental Science, proposed that pyromania represented a form of monomania, an otherwise functional individual possessed by a singular, irresistible compulsion. Neither theory adequately encompassed William Pritchard's particular pathology. For Pritchard's fires were not indiscriminate acts of mindless destruction. They were targeted, methodical, and, as would eventually become apparent, profoundly vengeful. Each building Pritchard selected had been a site of his own employment or that of family members. Each fire was set in a manner designed to maximize destruction whilst allowing Pritchard himself to escape undetected. And crucially, each fire occurred during periods of particular economic distress in Pritchard's own life: unemployment, debt, or domestic crisis. The fire was not an end in itself. It was a communication, a violent assertion of agency by a man whom society had rendered entirely powerless. By March of 1897, William Pritchard was living in a doss house on Flower and Dean Street, paying 4d per night for a canvas partition and the use of a communal kitchen. He had not secured regular employment in 3 years. His wife had left him in 1894, taking their 2 surviving children. His health was compromised by chronic bronchitis, the legacy of years breathing chemical fumes and coal smoke. On March 15, 1897, Pritchard presented himself at the Bryant and May factory, seeking re-employment. The personnel manager, a Mr. Harold Jessup, consulted the record books and discovered Pritchard's dismissal of 1881. Jessup refused his application. According to the testimony later provided by a clerk who overheard the exchange, Pritchard became agitated and vituperative, threatening that Jessup would regret this decision most severely. 48 hours later, the factory was ablaze. The investigation that followed was, by the standards of Victorian policing, exemplary. Detective Inspector Edmund Reed of H Division, a man of considerable experience who had served during the Whitechapel murders of 1888, recognized immediately that this was no accidental fire. The multiple points of origin, the barricaded doors, the murdered night watchman, all indicated premeditation and malice aforethought. Reed's inquiries at the factory revealed Pritchard's recent visit and threats. A search of Pritchard's lodgings uncovered materials consistent with arson, bottles of paraffin, matches, lengths of slow-burning taper. More damningly, in Pritchard's coat pocket was found a pocket watch bearing the initials TR, property of the deceased night watchman, Thomas Ridley. William Pritchard was apprehended at Spitalfields Market on the morning of March 19th. He did not resist arrest. When cautioned, he replied, according to Detective Inspector Reed's contemporaneous notes, they had it coming. All of them had it coming. The trial of William George Pritchard commenced at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, on May 4, 1897. The executioner was James Billington, and the official witnesses recorded that death was instantaneous. Pritchard made no final statement. His body was interred within the prison walls, in accordance with the custom for executed felons, and marked only by his initials and the date. He was 31 years old. In the ledger of Newgate Prison, the entry for William Pritchard concludes with a brief notation, died impenitent. History does not permit us simple moralities. William Pritchard was, indisputably, a murderer and an arsonist whose crimes destroyed property, livelihoods, and lives. The law, in executing him, fulfilled its function as society's ultimate sanction against intolerable transgression. And yet, we cannot examine Pritchard's life without confronting uncomfortable questions about the society that shaped him. Born into Dickensian poverty, denied education, exploited by industries that treated human beings as expendable machinery, Pritchard existed within a social order that was, in its own way, profoundly violent. The match factories continued to operate, continued to poison their workers with phosphorus, until public outcry finally forced regulatory reform in 1908. The slums of the East End persisted until the Blitz of 1940 accomplished what social policy had failed to achieve, their complete destruction. The vast gulf between prosperity and destitution that characterized Victorian Britain has diminished, though it has not disappeared. William Pritchard's fires were acts of terrible violence, born of rage and desperation. They solved nothing. They improved nothing. They merely added to the sum total of human suffering in a world already abundant with it. But neither can we dismiss them as the actions of a simply wicked man, a man who discovered, too late and at terrible cost, that fire was the one power that circumstances had left him. Understanding this does not excuse William Pritchard, but it may, perhaps, remind us that the distinction between civilization and barbarism is more fragile than we care to acknowledge, and that a society which treats its most vulnerable members as disposable should not be entirely surprised when some of those members strike back with whatever weapons desperation places in their hands. The Bryant and May Match Factory was rebuilt and continued operations until 1979. A commemorative plaque now marks the site, celebrating the courage of the match girls who struck for dignity and justice in 1888. There is no memorial to William Pritchard, nor to Thomas Ridley, the night watchman whose only misfortune was to be working when rage and revenge arrived in the darkness. History remembers whom it chooses to remember. The rest are consigned to the flames of oblivion, their stories told, if at all, in the dusty ledgers of police courts and prison records, footnotes to an age of empire and industry, poverty and punishment, crime and consequence. This has been the Match Factory Arsonist.